The forest was alive. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, the underbrush shifting as tiny creatures darted through the fresh spring growth. Sunlight streamed through the trees, but even daylight did not promise safety here. Then crack. A sharp sound tore through the calm. Two bear cubs, small and defenseless, burst from the thick brush. Their paws kicked up dirt as they stumbled forward, their panicked breath visible in the cool morning air. Something was behind them. They knew it. Their mother had left, searching for food, but she hadn't returned. And now they were alone. Their little hearts pounded. Their eyes darted in every direction. The larger cub, slightly older, led the way, pushing its sibling forward, urging them to run faster. But it was hopeless. The scent of fear was thick around them, unmistakable. Then movement. Shadows slithered between the trees, silent, calculating. The forest had been alive with birdsong only moments ago. Now, there was nothing but the sound of paws pressing against the damp earth. The wolves had arrived. A low growl rumbled through the air, so deep it seemed to vibrate through the very ground. A warning, promise. The cubs stumbled, whimpering as they realized they were surrounded. For wolves, lean from the winter, their eyes gleaming with hunger. They did not rush. They didn't need to. I crouched low in the bushes, my breath held tight in my chest. My rifle was slung over my shoulder, but I hadn't lifted it yet. Not yet. The leader of the pack stepped forward, his coat a mix of gray and black, his eyes locked onto the cubs. They were nothing more than easy prey. He knew it. The pack knew it. It was only a matter of time. The older cub tried to make itself look bigger, standing its ground, baring its tiny teeth. A laughable attempt. One of the wolves snapped its jaws in response, more amused than threatened. The smaller cub pressed against its sibling, shaking. Their mother had always been there to protect them, but she wasn't coming back. Was she? The wolves circled, patient. There was no need to rush. This was nature's way. The cubs would struggle, they would cry, but the outcome was inevitable. The leader finally moved, his muscles coiling, ready to strike. And then, just as the leader tensed to lunge, something changed. The wolves hesitated. Their ears twitched, their bodies stiffened. A new sound, one that did not belong in the rhythm of the hunt. It was distant at first, almost imperceptible. But then it grew louder. A branch snapped, a footstep, heavy, deliberate. The forest was not empty. The wolves exchanged glances, their instincts kicking in. Predators understood danger as well as prey did. Whatever was coming, it was big. The wind shifted, carrying a scent unfamiliar to the pack. It was not a bear, not a deer, not something they could ignore. The cubs, still trembling, hardly noticed the change. Their world had shrunk to the hunger in the wolves' eyes, the inevitability of their fate. But now the wolves were uncertain. Their leader let out a low, guttural noise, a signal to the others. Wait, another step, closer this time, then another. The sound of movement, slow and steady. Whoever, whatever it was, wasn't trying to hide. Then, through the trees, a shadow appeared, and the wolves, the fearless hunters, took a step back. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sweat, gunpowder, and something older, something that didn't belong. The wolves felt it first, their bodies tense, ears twitching as they tried to make sense of the disturbance. Their prey should have been helpless. Instead, something else had entered the scene. 100 yards away, Jake and I moved through the trees. I was tall and broad, my jacket worn from years of use, rifle slung over my shoulder. Jake, smaller and wiry, had a cautious step, his eyes darting between the shadows. We were hunters, but not the kind the wolves feared. I stopped first, raising a hand. I listened. "You hear that?" I muttered. Jake, younger and less experienced, tilted his head. The usual forest sounds had gone silent, save for the occasional rustling of branches. Then he caught it, the heavy, uneven breathing. Not an elk, not a deer, something else. Wolves? He guessed. I exhaled slowly, nodding. More than that. The wolves still hadn't attacked. That was the problem. A pack like this, fresh out of winter, should have torn the cubs apart in seconds. But they hesitated. That wasn't instinct. That was fear. I knew that feeling. "Let's move in slow," I whispered. Step by step, we approached the clearing. Through the gaps in the trees, the scene unfolded. For wolves, rigid, ears pinned back. 2 bear cubs, shaking but still alive. And something else, just beyond the tree line. A presence the wolves recognized but refused to challenge. Jake sucked in a breath. "What the hell is going on?" I didn't answer right away. My fingers tightened around my rifle, but I didn't raise it. Instead, I watched, observed. The leader of the pack stood its ground, but it wasn't looking at the cubs anymore. It was looking past them, toward the same unseen force that had stopped them from attacking. Then the sound came again. A grunt, deep, guttural, not human, not fully animal. The kind of sound that lived in old stories. The wolves heard it and took another step back. "Jesus," Jake whispered. "Should we shoot?" I shook my head. "Not yet." The wolves made their decision first. Their leader let out a low, warning growl, but it wasn't directed at the cubs anymore. With one last glance at the darkness beyond the trees, the pack turned, disappearing into the underbrush as quickly as they had come. That should have been the end of it. But the forest didn't relax. The birds didn't start singing again. And those bear cubs, they were still trapped. Because whatever had scared the wolves away hadn't left. Jake took a slow step forward, adjusting his grip on his rifle. "What do we do?" I hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "We see what's still out there." Then, from the tree line, something shifted. A shadow detached from the darkness. And this time, it wasn't running away. Jake swallowed hard. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he held his ground. He had seen predators before, bears, wolves, even mountain lions. But this was different. The shape moved slowly, deliberately, and as it stepped into the dappled light, I caught a glimpse of something massive. I took a step forward, raising my rifle slightly, not in aggression but in warning. "Stay calm," I murmured. "Whatever it is, it doesn't want to be ignored." The bear cubs were still frozen, their tiny bodies huddled together. They weren't running. They weren't even trying to escape. If anything, they seemed to be waiting. Then the shadow fully emerged. The air in the clearing felt heavier. Jake clenched his jaw, adjusting his grip on his rifle. The thing in front of us was no ordinary animal. It was big, bigger than any bear I had ever seen. And the worst part? It was watching us. The clearing was thick with tension. Jake and I remained still, rifles lowered but ready. The wolves had vanished into the underbrush, their retreat silent and swift, but whatever had driven them away had not left. Then it stepped forward. At first, I thought it was a bear, a massive one. Its dark fur blended with the shadows of the trees, but as it moved into the light, I saw the truth. It was a fully grown male grizzly, larger than any I had seen before. His shoulders rolled with raw strength, muscles shifting beneath the thick coat of fur, eyes locked on the wolves. Jake tightened his grip on his rifle. "That bear's huge," he muttered. I didn't answer. I had seen big bears before, but this one carried itself differently. It wasn't just defending territory, it had a purpose. The bear let out a deep, rumbling growl, one that vibrated through the trees. The cubs shrank back, confused, unsure whether they were in greater danger now than when the wolves surrounded them. Then chaos erupted. From the trees, the wolves reappeared, not as hunters but as something else. Defenders? Rivals? The leader of the pack, the same wolf that had hesitated before, lunged forward, snapping its jaws at the bear. Another followed, darting in from the side, aiming for the legs. The clearing exploded into a frenzied battle. The bear reared up, slashing with terrifying power, sending one of the wolves flying back into the brush. The impact was brutal, a sharp yelp swallowed by the noise of the struggle. But the wolves didn't back down. They worked as one, using speed and coordination, weaving between the bear's massive limbs. "What the hell are we looking at?" Jake hissed. I shook my head. "A fight we don't belong in. One of the wolves managed to sink its teeth into the bear's flank, drawing blood, dark and thick. But instead of recoiling in pain, the grizzly let out a furious roar and threw the wolf off as if it weighed nothing. The leader of the pack lunged again, but this time the bear anticipated it. With a swipe of its massive paw, it caught the wolf mid-air, slamming it into the ground. The pack faltered. Their leader did not get up. The wolves hesitated, their formation breaking. The bear turned its head slowly, watching them, nostrils flaring. Blood dripped from its claws. It had proven its dominance, and the message was clear. This was not their fight to win. The wolves, beaten but not broken, slowly began to retreat. Their bodies tense, ears pinned back. They backed into the forest one by one until only the massive grizzly and the two tiny cubs remained. The clearing was eerily quiet now, the echoes of the struggle fading into the trees. Then the bear turned its gaze on us. I tensed, gripping my rifle a little tighter. Jake swallowed hard, stepping slightly closer to me. "What do we do?" Jake whispered. I exhaled, slow and steady. "We wait." The bear studied us, as if weighing a decision of its own. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, it turned back toward the bear cubs. They remained frozen, their small bodies trembling, but something in the way they looked at the massive bear suggested recognition. And then, without a sound, the bear nudged one of them forward. I sucked in a sharp breath. "It's not here to kill them." Jake stared, unable to comprehend. The bear, this thing that had just fought off an entire wolf pack, was not a threat. He was here for his own. The silence in the clearing was thick, almost suffocating. Jake and I remained frozen, watching as the massive grizzly nudged the cubs forward. It was a strange, almost gentle moment, one that didn't belong in the brutal order of the wild. But then the balance of the forest shifted again. A sharp rustle in the underbrush. Jake flinched, his instincts kicking in. He wasn't like me. He hadn't spent his whole life reading the language of the woods. He only saw threats, not the meaning behind them. The rifle was already at his shoulder before I could stop him. "Wait!" Too late. A gunshot ripped through the forest. The bullet whizzed through the clearing, missing its intended mark. The bear roared in shock and rage, the cubs crying out in fear. But the real mistake wasn't the shot. It was where the bullet landed. A sharp yelp. Jake's stomach dropped. He hadn't hit the bear. He had hit one of the cubs. The small creature stumbled, collapsing onto its side, a thin line of crimson spreading through its fur. Its tiny, panicked breaths came in sharp gasps, eyes darting in confusion. I swore under my breath. "Goddamn idiot." The grizzly's head snapped toward us. His body, which had held a measure of calm before, now pulsed with fury. The line had been crossed. He no longer saw us as bystanders. We were threats. Jake took an uncertain step back, rifle trembling in his hands. I didn't mean to." "Shut up," I growled. My grip tightened around my rifle, though I knew it wouldn't help us now. A wounded cub, an enraged father. There was no walking away from this cleanly. Then came the second mistake. The wolves had not left completely. They had been watching, waiting, and now, sensing weakness, they returned. The leader was gone, but the pack was still a force to be reckoned with. They no longer attacked out of hunger. This was something else. This was a fight for dominance. The grizzly turned, his attention split. He knew the wolves were back. He knew his cub was injured. He knew we still stood there, weapons in hand. 3 threats. The wolves lunged first. A blur of fur and teeth. They moved as one, going low, trying to bring the bear down by his legs. But he was ready this time. With a powerful swipe, he sent the first wolf tumbling through the dirt, its ribs crunching on impact. Another clamped its jaws around his hind leg, but he twisted, shaking it off with sheer force. Jake took a step back, panicked. "We have to get out of here. Not without fixing your goddamn mistake." I shot back. I moved, fast, toward the fallen cub. It was still alive, still breathing, but fading. The larger cub stood over its sibling, making small, distressed sounds. It didn't understand what was happening. It only knew that its world was unraveling. I knelt, pulling a cloth from my pack. I wasn't a doctor, but I could slow the bleeding. The wolves weren't done. One of them broke past the bear's defense, leaping toward us. Jake reacted on instinct again. This time his shot found its target. The wolf collapsed mid-air, its body hitting the ground with a heavy thud. The pack hesitated. Their numbers were dwindling, their leader gone, their attack faltering. The bear, bloodied but still standing, let out a final, thunderous roar. The wolves broke. They turned and ran, disappearing into the trees like ghosts. I pressed harder against the cub's wound. "Stay with me, little one." The bear, panting, turned toward me. Our eyes met. A silent understanding passed between us. Then the grizzly took a slow step forward. The clearing was a battlefield. Blood smeared the dirt, mixing with torn tufts of fur and deep claw marks. The heavy breathing of the grizzly echoed through the silence, his massive body heaving from exertion. The wolves had retreated, but not all of them had left. Two still remained. I noticed it first. These wolves weren't preparing for another attack. They weren't stalking the injured cub, nor were they watching the grizzly with the same predatory hunger as before. They were waiting. Jake swallowed hard, shifting on his feet. "Why aren't they leaving?" I didn't answer right away. My fingers pressed against the cub's wound, keeping the cloth in place to slow the bleeding. I knew that look in the wolf's eyes. It wasn't desperation. It wasn't fear. It was something else entirely. "They aren't hunting anymore," I murmured. Jake scoffed. "What does that mean?" I finally looked up, my gaze locked on the remaining wolves. One of them, a lean, scarred female, had her ears pinned back. Not in aggression, but in contemplation. The other, a younger male, sat low to the ground, tail still, body tense but not in preparation to pounce. "They're deciding," I muttered. Jake's confusion deepened. "Deciding what?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, my mind drifted back. Years ago, a different hunt, a different time. I had seen this before. Wolves didn't fight senseless battles. They didn't waste energy. They tested, they learned, and they adapted. And sometimes they made decisions that no human could quite understand. I had once seen a wolf spare an injured elk, not out of mercy, but because it wasn't the right kill. The pack had found something else that night. Something easier, something smarter. Wolves weren't monsters. They were survivalists. And now they were looking at the bear, at the cubs, at us. Then, something unexpected happened. The scarred female lowered her head, then turned, slowly, deliberately, toward the trees. She took a few steps, then paused, glancing back at her companion. A silent signal. The younger male hesitated, torn between instinct and something deeper. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he followed. They disappeared into the shadows, their movements effortless, leaving nothing but silence in their wake. Jake let out a shaky breath. "What the hell just happened?" I exhaled, finally lifting my hands from the cub's wound. "They chose to walk away." Jake shook his head. "That doesn't make sense." "Doesn't have to." I wiped my blood-stained hands on my coat. Not everything in the wild follows the rules we expect. For the first time in his life, Jake looked uncertain. Not because of the towering bear or the power of the wolves, but because of the realization that he didn't understand this world as well as he thought. He had always believed that animals acted on instinct alone, but today he had seen hesitation, decision, something dangerously close to reason. The bear had not attacked us. The wolves had chosen not to kill. And somewhere in the middle of it all, two men had been given the chance to witness something rare. The silence stretched on, heavy and expectant. Then, the bear grunted low in its throat and nudged its injured cub again, urging it forward. The larger cub stuck close, its small, worried eyes flicking between its father and its wounded sibling. I stood slowly, my muscles stiff from kneeling. "We need to move." Jake hesitated. "What if they come back?" "They won't." And somehow, I knew that was the truth. The wounded cub whimpered, its tiny body trembling with exhaustion. Blood still seeped from the gunshot wound, staining its fur a dark crimson. I pressed a firm hand to the makeshift bandage, but I could feel the warmth of the blood soaking through. Time was running out. "We need to stop the bleeding," I muttered, pulling a strip of cloth from my pack. "If we don't, it won't last much longer." Jake hovered nearby, his hands twitching at his sides. He was still shaken from his mistake, but now wasn't the time for guilt. "Should we try to move it?" I shook my head. "Not yet. We do that wrong and we make it worse." The father bear remained close, his massive form casting a shadow over us. His heavy breathing was labored, his body still tense from the earlier fight. His eyes flickered between us and his cub, his instincts screaming at him to protect, to react. But something held him in place. The weight of exhaustion, maybe, or something deeper, a recognition that, for now, we weren't enemies. The larger cub nudged its wounded sibling, letting out a soft, distressed sound. It wanted to help but didn't know how. It was helpless. We all were. Then the wind shifted. I noticed at first the faint change in the air. Carried something new, something that didn't belong. The forest had just begun to settle after the chaos. But now, it bristled with something unseen. Footsteps. Not wolves. Not the careful, deliberate steps of a predator stalking prey. This was different, more calculated, more controlled. Then a voice. Low, cautious. "Put your hands where I can see them." I froze. So did Jake. Slowly, I turned, keeping my hands in plain sight. From the tree line, a third man emerged, his rifle raised but not yet aimed. His jacket was dark, practical, his stance steady. He was no amateur. Jake stiffened. "Who the hell are you?" The newcomer didn't lower his gun. His eyes flicked between the injured cub, the grizzly, and us. Saw the shot, followed the noise. His gaze landed on my hands, still pressed to the cub's side. "That you're doing?" Jake bristled. "It was an accident." The man's expression didn't change. "Doesn't matter." The bear let out a low growl, shifting slightly. The newcomer's grip on his rifle tightened instinctively, but he didn't lift it toward the animal. He understood just as well as we did, the wrong move could set everything off again. I exhaled slowly. "If you're here to help, then help." A long pause. Then, to our surprise, the newcomer slung his rifle over his shoulder and moved forward. He crouched beside the wounded cub, studying the wound with a practiced eye. "Through and through." I nodded. "It's bad, but not fatal if we stop the bleeding." The newcomer didn't hesitate. He pulled a small pouch from his jacket and dumped out a roll of gauze and a small tin of antiseptic powder. Without a word, he started working. Jake glanced at me, wary. "Who is this guy?" I didn't answer. I didn't know, but at this moment it didn't matter. The only thing that did was the cub, still clinging to life beneath our hands. Minutes passed in tense silence. The bear didn't move. The forest held its breath. Then, finally, the newcomer sat back, exhaling. "That'll hold." The cub's breathing was still shallow, but steadier. The bleeding had slowed. There was a chance. The father bear took a step forward, towering over us. The newcomer tensed, but I lifted a hand, a silent signal to stay still. The bear sniffed the air, then lowered his massive head. For a moment, it looked as though he might lash out, but instead he nudged the cub, huffing softly. The small bear stirred. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "It's not over yet," I muttered. "But at least it's a chance." The newcomer stood, dusting off his hands. "You should clear out." Jake frowned. "Why?" The man gave a tight smile. "Because I don't think we're the only ones who heard that shot." The forest was still, but it was the kind of stillness that came before another storm. I stood near the wounded cub, my breath visible in the crisp air. The father bear loomed over me, his dark eyes flicking between his offspring and me. I wiped my bloody hands on my jacket, exhaling. "We need to move." Jake, the younger hunter, hesitated. "And just leave them here?" The other man, the one who had arrived from the shadows, his name was Cole, shifted his weight. "It's not our place to decide what happens next." But was that true? Hadn't we already interfered? A cub had been wounded by our mistake. We had helped, but did that balance the scale? The weight of that question pressed against my ribs. Nature had its own laws, but humans had a way of breaking them, bending them to their own will. The father bear huffed, his body still tense, still wary. He hadn't attacked. Not yet. Perhaps he understood, in some primal way, that we had tried to fix what we had broken. Or maybe he was just waiting for the right moment. I took a slow step back. We walk away now, and maybe he lets us. Jake wasn't convinced. He looked at the cub, still weak, its siblings standing protectively over it. What if it doesn't make it? Cole scoffed. That's not our choice to make. The words hit harder than I expected. I had spent years hunting, tracking, taking life when it suited me. But now, with this tiny, helpless creature lying in the dirt, the weight of that reality felt unbearable. Jake made his choice. Without another word, he crouched down, sliding his hands carefully under the wounded cub. The little bear let out a weak sound, but it didn't struggle. It didn't have the strength. The father bear growled. "Easy," I warned. "This isn't smart." Cole took a step back, one hand resting on his rifle strap. He wasn't going to interfere, but he wasn't going to help either. Jake lifted the cub. It was warm, its tiny body trembling. He turned toward me, his jaw set. "We take it." The father bear took a step forward, his muscles tensing. A line had been crossed. There was no going back now. I swore under my breath. "Damn it, Jake." The grizzly let out a sound that wasn't quite a roar, but it was close. A warning, a demand. "Give it back." Jake didn't move. "It won't survive out here." The bear took another step, and I knew we were seconds away from disaster. "We can't do this." Cole, watching from the side, let out a dry chuckle. "You boys figure this out. I'm not dying today." The tension was suffocating. The bear, Jake, the cub, all of it hanging on the edge of something irreversible. Then I did something I never thought I would. I stepped in front of Jake, putting myself between the bear and the cub in his arms. Not with a gun, not with aggression, just with presence. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the father bear stopped. His breathing was heavy, his body still trembling with exhaustion. He looked at me, then at his cub, and then he let out a breath. Not a roar, not a growl, just an exhale, deep and full of something that wasn't quite surrender but wasn't rage either. I nodded once. "Put it down. Now." Jake hesitated but knew I was right. Carefully, he knelt and placed the cub back onto the earth. The father bear stepped forward, sniffing his injured child. The larger cub pressed against its sibling, offering comfort in the only way it knew how. I turned away first. "We walk. Slow." And we did. Step by step, we backed away, never turning our backs, never running. The bear didn't follow. We reached the tree line, and only then did Jake speak. "Do you think it'll live?" I didn't look back. "That's not up to us." Cole gave a smirk, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "Guess we'll never know." And with that, we disappeared into the forest, leaving the bears behind. The forest had returned to its rhythm, but the scars remained. The clearing where it had all happened still bore the marks of the struggle. Deep claw marks in the dirt, patches of dried blood, tufts of fur scattered like remnants of a war long past. It had been 4 days. I sat on the porch of my cabin, staring at the tree-line. I hadn't spoken much since that day. Jake had asked me once, just once, if I thought the cub had survived. I hadn't answered, just took a slow drag from my cigarette before changing the subject. Some things weren't meant to be known. Jake, restless as always, had gone back into the woods. Maybe he was searching for something. Answers, closure, or just a sign that what we had witnessed was real. But the forest does not give up its secrets so easily. When he came back to the clearing, it was quiet. Too quiet. The usual rustle of birds, the distant calls of animals. It was all absent. He crouched, running his fingers over the ground where the cub had lain. There was no fresh blood, no signs of a body. Either the cub had survived or something had taken it. But there were no tracks, at least none he could see. Then he noticed something else. The wolves had not returned. No fresh prints. No disturbed earth. The pack had left, disappeared into the depths of the forest as if they had never been there at all. He exhaled, standing slowly. The forest was different now. He could feel it. It wasn't fear, it wasn't even unease. It was just something else. A shift. A change. He turned to leave but stopped. There, between the trees, something moved. Not a bear. Not a deer. It was too still, too aware. Jake narrowed his eyes, adjusting to the dimming light of the evening. A pair of golden eyes blinked back at him from the shadows. He held his breath, his fingers instinctively twitching toward the rifle at his back. But he didn't lift it. He just stood there, staring, waiting. The eyes didn't move. They watched, studied, judged. Then, without a sound, they disappeared, melting into the trees like smoke. Jake exhaled, his pulse steady but his mind racing. He turned and walked away, not looking back this time. By the time he reached the cabin, I was still there, still staring at the trees. "They're gone," he said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "The wolves." I nodded slowly. "They were never really here to begin with." Jake frowned. "What does that mean?" I sighed, tapping ash from my cigarette. "Some things in the wild don't need explaining. They just are." He didn't press further. He just sat down on the steps, watching the last light fade beyond the trees. And somewhere, deep in the woods, something watched back.